So we want to think about autonomic neurotransmitters and receptors. And there are cholinergic receptors. A cholinergic receptor binds acetylcholine, and adrenergic receptors, which bind catecholamines. They can bind norepinephrine either as a neurotransmitter or as a hormone. Remember, we made that distinction. You can find it in both forms, same chemical. And that goes true for epinephrine and dopamine as well. So adrenergic receptors can bind all of our catecholamines as hormones or as neurotransmitters. Okay, so that is the types of receptors that we're going to find throughout the autonomic system. Let's look at the neurotransmitters and which neurons release which neurotransmitters. So first off, again, this is another thing to really just stick in your mind. All preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine. Definitely write that somewhere, highlight it, bold it, underline it. Preganglionic neurons on both divisions always release acetylcholine. Okay, that's a rule with no exception. Parasympathetic, when you look at the postganglionic neurons, now this is where we get into some difference. So parasympathetic postganglionic neurons also release acetylcholine. However, sympathetic postganglionic neurons usually release catecholamines, so norepinephrine or some degree of epinephrine, etc. So on the sympathetic side, the postganglionic neurons usually release norepinephrine, but there is an exception here with sweat glands. So the sympathetic side, for sweat glands specifically, their postganglionic sympathetic neurons release acetylcholine. Okay, and then we also see these catecholamines released from the adrenal medulla as well in the form of a hormone. This goes directly into the blood supply, into the blood vessels. Okay, so it's majority epinephrine and then some norepinephrine and a very tiny amount of dopamine can be released as a hormone as well. So again, the rule of thumb, all preganglionic, always acetylcholine. On the parasympathetic side, postganglionic is also acetylcholine. So another way to look at this is on the parasympathetic side, it's all acetylcholine. Both the preganglionic and the postganglionic both release acetylcholine. On the sympathetic side, preganglionic releases acetylcholine. The postganglionic, for the most part, releases norepinephrine, but the exception with sweat glands is that they also release acetylcholine. And then we can see hormones being released from the chromaffin cells as well. So this is just a schematic to look at that in another way. So here is our preganglionic neuron. This is the sympathetic side only. Preganglionic neurons, we had 3 routes of communication for those. One to the sympathetic chain. So from the CNS to the sympathetic chain. And notice that the preganglionic neuron here releases acetylcholine. It's going to cross the junction and bind to a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, and then the signal will be transmitted on the postganglionic neuron. The second route is to the adrenal medulla chromaffin cell. So the preganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine as always, binding to that nicotinic cholinergic receptor, and then these chromaffin cells will release their secretions into the blood. Third option, a ganglia that's not a part of the sympathetic chain, still releasing acetylcholine from the preganglionic neuron, binding to the receptor and having an effect on the postganglionic neuron. Okay. However, I want you to notice that the postganglionic neurons here, the 2 in the top option, which is the sympathetic chain, bottom option, which is the collateral ganglia, their postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine, which we can see here. And then from the chromaffin cells, we can get epinephrine, usually, which is the majority, but again, to a smaller extent, we can get norepinephrine, dopamine as well. So this is showing what the preganglionic neuron releases and what the postganglionic neuron releases on the sympathetic side. The parasympathetic side, automatically before even looking at this, you should have it in your mind, both of these neurons are releasing acetylcholine. There's no adrenergic receptors here. There's no epinephrine, no norepinephrine. There's no catecholamines involved at all on the parasympathetic side. So the preganglionic neuron, which remember is a longer neuron, releases its acetylcholine at the synapse here at the ganglia, and then it binds to a receptor. And the postganglionic neuron is also releasing acetylcholine, so they're both cholinergic neurons. However, the type of cholinergic receptor they bind to differs. At the ganglia, it's a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, which is a fast receptor. If you remember us talking about ionotropic receptors, where the receptor is a channel. So these nicotinic cholinergic receptors are fast receptors. The other type of cholinergic receptor is a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. Both can bind acetylcholine, but their mechanism is going to be different, and their rate, the speed with which they bring about a response, is also different. So this muscarinic cholinergic receptor is going to bind acetylcholine, and then it's going to have a little bit of a slower response to bring about the effect on these effector organs. Okay, so that's what we're going to kind of get into here, the distinction between nicotinic cholinergic receptors and muscarinic cholinergic receptors. So nicotinic are ionotropic, so they are fast because the receptor is also a channel. So when that acetylcholine binds here, the channel automatically opens up. We usually have sodium and potassium flow, more sodium in than potassium out. And then we depolarize that postganglionic neuron almost automatically, right? Really fast response. The muscarinic cholinergic receptor is a metabotropic receptor. So automatically you should be thinking G protein, second messenger, slower response, more specific response. And so this is going to be coupled to that G protein. And then that, series of events will eventually bring about the effect on the target cell. Now, if you think about the speed of the response, it kind of makes sense, right? If you kind of understand it, you won't have to memorize it as much. So here we need a fast response. When we go from preganglionic to postganglionic, it should be automatic. Here, the response is going to be slower and more specific because it's dependent upon exactly which effector tissue we're looking at. This effector tissue can be the heart, can be the lungs, can be the intestines, can be salivary glands. So the unique effect is going to differ depending on exactly where this muscarinic receptor is. Therefore, the sequence of events may differ, the second messenger may differ, and the response is going to be more specific but slower at the effector junction, at the effector cell. Let's look at the location of the cholinergic receptors here. So where do we find cholinergic receptors? We find them at the autonomic ganglia. We have nicotinic fast receptors. At the effector organ, we have muscarinic or slow receptors. And then we also are going to see cholinergic receptors when we get to the somatic system. So this is the next chapter that we'll look at, the skeletal muscles. This is our voluntary peripheral nervous division, and we're also going to see nicotinic cholinergic receptors here. And again, it kind of makes sense. When we move skeletal muscle, that needs to be fast, that needs to be responsive, right? Not a second messenger to another second messenger to another to then get the response. So for movement of skeletal muscle, that needs to be responsive, that needs to be quick. And so we're going to see that with the skeletal, with the somatic nervous system. And then the other exception here where we see muscarinic receptors are sweat glands on the sympathetic side, where those postganglionic neurons also release acetylcholine. And so they bind to muscarinic receptors on the sweat gland. Although they are in the sympathetic side, this is that one exception that we looked at earlier. Okay, let's look at the receptors. So where are these various catecholamines binding? So on the cholinergic side, we only have two, nicotinic, muscarinic. On the adrenergic side, we have many. So things become a little bit more complicated here. So we have two main classes, alpha and beta. And then within alpha and beta, we have subtypes. Now, remember, they're all muscarinic. It's not muscarinic, excuse me, they're all metabotropic. Metabotropic mean they're all coupled to G proteins, okay? So under alpha, we have alpha 1, alpha 2. Under beta, we have beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. Now, what you're going to need to know here for like testing purposes is where these receptors are found And what do they bind? Do they have an affinity? Do they prefer epinephrine over norepinephrine? Do they prefer dopamine? Do they have no specific affinity? Do they have an equal affinity for both? So that's kind of what we're going to look at with each subclass of these receptors. So looking at the alpha adrenergic receptors, these are going to be on the effector organs, on the sympathetic division. They're the most abundant. They're usually excitatory. Excitatory meaning that they usually bring about an excitatory response. So increasing the tone in smooth muscle or increasing the sympathetic, the smooth muscle tone or contraction in your blood vessels, increasing heart, the rate of heartbeat, just overall increase or excitation is the response we usually see here. They have an affinity that's greater for norepinephrine over epinephrine. Definitely underline this is going to come back. They prefer norepinephrine over any of the other, over epinephrine, over dopamine as well. Beta receptors are all going to be activating cyclic AMP as their second messenger. I'll talk about what that means when you look at the exact second messenger response or the signal transduction cascade. But they all are going to be involved with cyclic AMP as their main second messenger. What they're going to do to cyclic AMP is going to differ. Whether they increase it or decrease it will differ, but they all are connected with cyclic AMP. The affinities for norepinephrine and epinephrine may vary depending on which beta subtype. So let's look at the beta subtypes. So for beta 1, these are found on the cardiac muscle in the heart and the kidneys. They are also usually excitatory, and they have an even or equal affinity. They have no preference, right? They'll take anything. Beta 2, these are found on blood vessels in some locations and smooth muscle, especially the lungs. You can definitely write that in here. The lungs, the uterus are some examples of where we find the smooth muscle that has beta 2 receptors. These are usually inhibitory, and I'll talk about what that means, but they usually have a dampened or a slowed response. An example would be the lungs, for example. Beta 2 receptors in the lungs causes bronchodilation, which is opening up, as opposed to contraction of the airway, opening up or inhibition or dilation of the airways, which for the lungs is needed. It makes sense for the lungs because when you're fighting, flighting, freezing, you want more air coming in, so you want to dilate your bronchial airways. For blood vessels, on the other end, that's going to be dilation of the blood vessel, which is not going to be in alignment with the sympathetic response. We're going to need contraction of blood vessels. So here, the inhibitory response, where we find beta 2 receptors, makes sense when you think about the overall sympathetic function. And these beta 2 receptors have a greater affinity for epinephrine. So alpha receptors preferred norepinephrine. Beta 1 had no preference. Beta 2 prefers epinephrine over norepinephrine. And then beta 3 is usually found on adipose or fat tissue, usually excitatory, and it also has an equal affinity and it doesn't have a preference. So beta 1 and beta 3 have no specific preference for their for norepinephrine versus epinephrine.